Hey guys, my name is Steve, and I head up the analytics engineering team at Dropbox. I've been at Dropbox for about 2 years now, and prior to that I was in my master's program at MIT and I dropped out. So today we're going to talk about analytics at Dropbox. During the first 15 minutes, as we mentioned, we're going to talk about what it means to do analytics at Dropbox, a bit about our data set, and then some of the open problems that we're excited to tackle over the next year or two. And like we said, this will set the stage for an informal Q&A with you guys, where you get to put me on the stage and on the spot, and I'll scramble to come up with passable answers. So to keep things interesting, I'll be sprinkling in a few analysis we've done over the past few years. Forgive me for not providing exact numbers on some of them. I think legal would have my head. So first, let me give you guys a brief introduction to Dropbox. How many of you guys have heard of Dropbox? All right, good. How many of you guys use Dropbox? All right, cool. How many of you guys pay for Dropbox? All right, well, we'll have to work on that. Cool. For those of you who like maybe have heard of it, don't really know what we're up to, let me give you the inside scoop. So I like to describe Dropbox to technical crowds such as you guys as a massive internet file system. At the center, you have this box, Dropbox, and we offer different views that allow you to interact with your data in your Dropbox. So the first is a syncing view. So if you download Dropbox onto your desktop client, such as your Windows, Mac, or Linux, and you put stuff into your folder, it'll sync to our servers, and then we'll propagate those changes to all of your other computers that you have Dropbox installed on. The second is a caching view, and this is what you see on the phone. You can't put all your stuff on the phone, and if you were to, it would take up your battery life in pretty insane ways. So we'll pull things on the fly when you need them. The third is a remote view, and this is Dropbox through the web. So you can go to a website and download your files on the go, maybe if you're using your friend's computer where you don't have the client installed, or like a public computer at a library. And the last view that you can have on your Dropbox is through the API, where developers create arbitrary views. So that sort of sets the stage for what Dropbox is. Now let's talk about what we're trying to do with analytics at Dropbox. So at a high level, we want to make Dropbox a data-driven company, and we do that in two big ways. The first is we try to inform decisions. So this could be justifying new features, or informing business deals, or even responding to abuse by the users we know and love. The second is monitoring core metrics over time. So we want to know like basic metrics about the health of our different platforms and our features. And then also track some high-level metrics like growth, engagement, and financials, things that we think everybody in the company should care about over time. So these translate in pretty well into like day-to-day work that we do. So we're of course doing some analysis, and here are a few examples. We recently launched this thing that we call internally Schmodel, and it stands for sharing model. It's a way for people to share stuff in a public way to friends or coworkers, but in a read-only way. So you get a link to the file and you can download it. Anyways, we did some analysis pre-launch, or actually even before while we were designing the feature, to see what sort of things people would put into these Schmodel links. And the justification was we wanted to focus on the right things, the right front-end visualization features for our users. So we looked at the public folder distribution, for example, to see what people would be using it for. We also did a bunch of analysis on Android usage to justify an HTC deal where we're now like pre-installed on a bunch of phones. And we even deal with abuse. So recently we launched something called camera uploads, where you can automatically sync photos you take on your phone or photos that you take on your camera when you plug them into your computer. They'll automatically get synced and pulled into your Dropbox. And we didn't want people to run out of space right away, so we started giving them extra space in 500 megabyte chunks, up to 5 gigs. And what we found is that a lot of people were just snapping away at taking a bunch of photos. They would reach their 5 gig limit, and then they would delete them all, so they could keep the extra space. And when we reduced it to something a little bit smaller, 3 gigs, we actually found that that abuse went down. The next big thing we do is we provide a bunch of tools for interacting with our data so that anyone in the company can interact with it in a self-serve way. And then dashboards. So here's an example of a dashboard we have. And so that you guys can't see all the numbers, I'm going to skip ahead. It's our secret sauce. And then finally, we do a lot of work to store all of our data. We handle terabytes and terabytes of data, many terabytes of data in the hundreds, and it should be petabytes by the end of the year. Cool. So this is what we do, but what sort of stuff do we have access to? What makes our data set interesting? At Dropbox, I feel like we have a data set unlike any other really in the world at our fingertips. And we can look at this data set in aggregate to learn interesting things about our business. So most often we analyze our users along basic dimensions derived from the metadata that we store to render the service to them, right? And when I say these dimensions, I'm talking about things like their language preference or their quota utilization. Actually, quota utilization is a really interesting one that we investigated about a year back. We wanted to understand user behavior as those users got close to using up all their quota. So we looked at the quota utilization of users a few weeks prior to upgrading, and we found a few interesting buckets of users. There was a lump of people that upgraded straight away, no questions asked. And then there was a bunch of people, maybe some of you guys, some of you students, who would teeter around the limit and remove stuff from their Dropbox so that they could add more stuff. And some would upgrade, some wouldn't. But we found that by sending like a tip email that said, oh, by the way, you can upgrade, that significantly improved the amount of upgrades, but also shortened the time to upgrade for that second set of users. More interestingly, though, we found a pretty large third class of users who upgraded way before hitting their quota limit. Now, there could be a lot of reasons why. Maybe work pays for it or something. But we compared the email domains, so like the domains. So we found the set of domains that were from corporate email addresses and compared that to consumer email addresses like Gmail or Yahoo. And the ratios were still very similar. My personal theory is that the comfort of knowing that you'll never run out of space is something that people are willing to pay for. And to further back this up, there's a huge fraction of users who pay for 100 gigabytes who are way below 50. This is completely bizarre to me. Don't tell legal, but that's about half the people that are paying for 100 gigabyte accounts have less than 50. And they could be paying for the 50 gigabyte plan. Anyways, we just doubled everybody's plans for free 2 days ago. So I'm personally curious to see how that changes the quota and upgrading dynamic over the next few weeks. Anyways, the next class of data that we look at is file metadata. We essentially know a bunch of different distributions about the world's most important files. We ran an interesting analysis about a year ago as well to determine like what was most important to people. What stuff were they putting in their Dropbox that they cared about most? This time we looked at what people put into their Dropbox 3 weeks after upgrading to a pro account, once they had space where they could finally put in their stuff. And we used file extension to categorize files into 4 categories: music, docs, images, and videos. So I'm going to pose this as a question to you guys. Which of these 4 types do you think took up the most space in someone's Dropbox 3 weeks after upgrading? So let's see hands for music. Cool. Docs. Cool. Images. Cool. How about videos? Sweet. I think I saw most for, I think images was about twice as many as any other category. And it turns out the most space utilization after you upgrade is taken up by images. And this makes sense because tons of people are using Dropbox to store their photos and have them wherever they go and share them with their friends and family. So a third type of compelling data, and probably more compelling than just file metadata, is the way that people interact with their files. We basically have a history of users from their Dropbox birth to the current state of things. And when you provide a tool that's like general, like Dropbox, there's just many, many different ways that people use it that manifest themselves in interesting usage patterns. Just at universities like Stanford, there's probably a half a dozen use cases that you guys are familiar with, like professors and TAs distributing content or collecting homework, students working together on group projects through shared folders, others keeping their lab computer and their dormitory computer in sync, some just having the comfort that if they go to campus and forget to print out that term paper, well, they can just go to a cluster, get it off the web, print it out there. Or worse yet, if somebody steals your computer or your computer gets damaged, all your thesis work is backed up in Dropbox and you can get at it and recover it. And that's just at schools. I mean, when we're talking about industry and at home, there's dozens of other use cases too. And I've heard some pretty bizarre ones that I'd like to share with you guys actually. I heard of there's this farmer who's written a program to automate his tractors, and he uses Dropbox to sync it to his tractors. That's a pretty fun one. There's this observatory, and every night they go to the observatory and process a lot of constellation data. But before, they would have to wait 2 hours for the data to process and load onto a USB drive so that they could bring it with them home, right? Now they point the results of their program to a Dropbox folder, and while they drive home, it's syncing. Here's a really good one. This is my personal favorite. There's these grandparents in Europe, and they have a computer. They don't know how to use it. They've never touched it. But when their son was visiting from the States, he pointed the screensaver to a Dropbox shared folder. And now the son adds photos of their grandchildren into the Dropbox, and they can watch them grow up. It's a really fun one. Now, obviously, syncing photos to your grandparents' screensavers isn't a big use case for us. But the point is that when you provide somebody with a very general utility, they'll find creative ways to use it. And making sense of all these different use cases is a challenging and really interesting problem for us on analytics. And of course, in addition to all of the above, we have a pretty rich sharing and referral graph that connects all this together. In fact, about half of our new users come in through sharing and referral. Cool. And in addition to being really interesting, we also operate at a pretty impressive scale. Dropbox, the service, handles many, many petabytes of file data. I can't tell you exactly how much, unfortunately. But I can tell you that on average, people save more than 500 million files to Dropbox every day. And don't quote me on this, but I believe that's more than there are Twitters on Tweet, and we don't have that annoying character limit. And for analytics, what this means is that we have billions and billions of new records added to our Hadoop cluster every day, which poses a really interesting scaling problem for us. Cool. So now I'm going to talk to you guys about some of the problems, some of the open problems we're interested in solving in the future. Because as you guys noticed, a lot of the analyses we've talked about so far have been pretty simple. Things that you don't really need a PhD to figure out. However, we found that simple analysis are often the quickest and most informative ways to get answers about our business. But there are some really interesting questions that we do want to ask where people with a more focused background could have a lot of impact. So as we talked about earlier, a lot of people are using Dropbox to store all of their photos. And we've built a bunch of features to help them get photos into their Dropbox. So we're quickly becoming one of the world's largest photo databases. One of the things that people have a really hard time with right now is organizing their photos. And we think that since we have a lot of people's photos, we're in a good position to solve that problem for them. So we want to do things like create albums for you based on simple heuristics like time and location, but also more complicated things like organizing your photos for you by the people in your photos or the stuff in your photos. More than that, we should be able to figure out, of the 4 photos you took in rapid succession, they're all the same, really, based on time or the contents. And we should even be able to pick out the best one for you based on contrast or brightness or lighting, whatever. And photos is just one of the verticals that we can tackle and help make people's lives easier. Others include documents, movies, and music. Like I mentioned earlier, there are people all over the world from different walks of life using Dropbox for very different things. And I believe we could do a pretty good job of classifying our user base. In fact, we probably have enough information within the first few minutes to know if somebody's going to be using Dropbox for school or for work or for personal use. And that's pretty valuable information to know when you're trying to onboard a user. You can really target your messaging to their particular use case and motivate the product for them. And we could also promote features that they wouldn't have discovered on their own based on what use case they are. Another really interesting problem that is particularly important when people's most important files are at stake is security and fraud. So we'll need to, in the next few years, come up with a way of automatically detecting hacked accounts and disabling them temporarily. But we'll also probably want to find accounts that are being used to distribute files in an illegal manner or in a spammy way. Anyways, these are just a few flavors of things we hope to do in the future. And right before we jump into the Q&A, I'm going to do a shameless plug for the whole we're hiring thing. I mean, hopefully I've done an okay job motivating our data set and the open problems we're going to tackle. Personally, I think we're in a pretty sweet spot at Dropbox, where we have a very small team, 55 people on the engineering team, growing extremely fast. We've tripled in the last year. And the analytics engineering team is 5 people, and the amount of data scientists we have is 0. So that doesn't exist yet. So if you're excited about building that out and you really want to get your hands dirty with some pretty cool data, I'd love to talk to you after. We're gonna start hiring for that. I'd also be curious to hear what you would do with a data set like Dropbox's. So you can email me at sbartel@dropbox.com if you're interested, or head to dropbox.com/jobs. Cool, so now is your chance to grill me with questions. And we can talk about whatever you want, but here are some broad categories. I forgot to mention, it wouldn't be a Dropbox talk if we weren't giving away free space. So anyone who asks a question gets 10 gigs. The question was, I mentioned Hadoop in my presentation. He was wondering what we were using on top of Hadoop to do analysis. And he mentioned Hive and Pig. So here's what our infrastructure looks like. It's not a cartoon, well, yeah, it's a nice cartoon image. And I'll actually walk you guys through a little bit of it. So we have 2 main ways of getting data into analytics, which is, and what we use to store all that data is Hadoop. And we use Hive on top of that to organize the data. So every night, we'll use Scoop, an open source tool that helps us copy in snapshots of production table about our user base and store those snapshots in the Hadoop cluster. Not only do you get the current state of all of your users, but by taking snapshots, you have a low granularity history of a bunch of important user attributes. The other way we get data into analytics is people just log stuff from our web servers. We call them meta servers. They live in we use Scribe which is flat file logging, to get data from our meta servers to a temporary Hadoop cluster. It's called Clogger for some reason. And then we use Hadoop's distcp to copy that over to our Hive cluster. So once this stuff is in Hive, or Hive and Hadoop, we can run queries in an automated way to transform tables that we're importing from Clogger and from production, like MySQL databases, into other tables, like summary tables. And then those from there, we'll cache some of the results into a caching layer for our dashboards that people can consume through the web. And then people can also write Hive queries against our data through a web terminal. And there's a lot of steps involved here. So we have some basic tooling around specifying pipelines and dependencies and making sure that things run on a recurring basis, but only after data exists for the things that it depends on. So that's our stack. Great question. So the question was, we have a lot of data, pretty interesting data. Have we considered opening it to the public? I think that's one of the first things we would try if we hired some data scientists. I think you want to expose the data in a way that makes sense. Pick a reasonable data set, and also make sure that you're obfuscating it in ways that you don't reveal personally identifiable information. That's the worst thing you can do. So, and I think once we have the bandwidth, once we have a few data scientists, that's something we would do. So the question was, I talked about the sharing and referral graph. How big is that graph? How many vertices? How many edges? I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I do know that around, I think, 70% of or 60 or 70% of users are in shared folders. And when people share a folder, they're sharing many of them, by and large. Like that's what we've found. But I don't know specifics, and even if I did, probably couldn't give you guys exact numbers. Cool, yeah, so the question was, I mentioned Hadoop, are we using our own data centers? And the answer is actually twofold. So we use Amazon S3 for storing file contents, and that's been extremely valuable to us. If Amazon S3 didn't exist, Dropbox wouldn't exist. It's a very hard system to build from scratch when you're just starting out, and we're still on that today. For our Hadoop cluster and for all of our metadata about users and their files, we store those. So for analytics, we manage our own Hadoop cluster in our own data center. And for production, we manage our own sharded MySQL databases, again in our own data centers. And currently, the data center is here in California. I can't tell you where. Yeah, so the question was, people are adding and changing things in their Dropbox on multiple computers. More specifically, I think the problem arises when you're collaborating with someone who's trying to change the same file. And right now, what we do is we spit out conflicted copies. And the question was, would we move towards something more like Git or like version control, right? Right. So I think that version control it's very easy for you and I to understand, but it's something that my mom who uses Dropbox, and even my grandparents would have a really hard time with. So we haven't done anything around that. I think what we might do though, once we have the bandwidth, is make it optional. So if you understand version control and you like using that, we should be able to present the two conflicted copies in a way that you can merge them together easily. Because right now, what the rest of the world has to do is go in and manually merge things. But I think that's actually simpler for people that aren't very familiar with version control and that technology to handle. So hopefully that answers your question. Cool. Yeah, so the question was, with a lot of people sharing stuff, how do we handle duplicate files? And we dedupe the files. So what we do is we'll take, I think, the SHA-256 of so first we split files up into 4 megabyte chunks. Then we take the SHA-256 of that data, which has extremely low chance of collision, and we'll use that to decide whether we can send that file to our warehouse, our servers, or if we can just let it be. Totally. Yeah. So the question was, have we looked into compression? And there's different types of compression for different files. For example, WAV files. Actually, I'm not sure if we compress files differently based on file type. I think we do. We certainly have compression, but I think it's generic applied to all of our files. And that's really because to us, files aren't file types. They're 4 megabyte chunks of files. So we handle it in a generic way. The question is, how do we plan to compete with Google Drive? And that's an interesting one. I think there's a few things at play here. One, I think we've got a pretty big head start on the user experience. I think Dropbox is more polished, handles a lot of the edge cases better than Google Drive. Two, I think Google Drive. Google is a very big company. They have their hands in a lot of pots, and that makes it hard because they first of all. They're focused on competing on a bunch of different products with a bunch of different big companies. So to Google, G Drive is actually equivalent to Google Docs, if you guys saw and have used it. So right now, I think what they're primarily focused on is building feature parity to Office on Google Docs. And I think it's going to be 3 or 4 years before they finally get there. And until they do, people are still going to need Dropbox to sync Word docs and things like that. And I think in the medium term, we can build some simple collaboration tools around documents, not trying to compete on full feature parity with Google Docs or with Microsoft's Office suite. But there are some simple things we could do to handle a lot of the use cases. I don't know if you guys have ever used Etherpad or anything, but we could build Etherpad++ or something, and it wouldn't take a whole lot of time. I think the third thing to think about when we're talking about big companies like Google is they have to sort of they're more inclined to use their own internal products and integrate with those than they are to integrate with an external product like Facebook. So I think for anything social, they're going to be stuck to using their own platforms like Google+. And with so many people on Facebook and Google+ not really having very much traction, I think that's also an advantage for us. Cool. Yeah, so the question was, I mentioned Amazon S3 for file storage, file content storage. Are we using any other commercial products on the analytics side of things? No, we're not using any commercial products. We use a lot of open source products. The reason being that if we actually do need to go in and fix something, it's a lot easier to do that when when the product's open sourced. You don't have to block on going back and forth with a company you're working with. I think in general we have a sort of like do-it-yourself mentality at Dropbox, for better for worse, and that's sort of why we stick with our own stuff. In terms of open source stuff we use, I mentioned Scoop, I mentioned Hive. We use Scribe, that's another open source thing. We use high charts to display our data on web interfaces. So yeah.